There we go. Good evening. I'll just pass you over to Dennis, who will introduce Richard.
Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the June webinar for Sentient Rights Ireland. Tonight's guest speaker is Richard Deboo, and we're very thankful to have him here, and we're looking forward to listening to what he says. So, without further ado, thank you, Richard. It's all yours.
Thank you. Well, thank you for the opportunity to come along and discuss all things vegan, I suppose, this evening, and all things to do with our non-human animal friends, which I think many of you on the call this evening will agree is, well, I've always regarded, and I've been saying for some years now, it is the most significant issue of the century in terms of how we regard and respect and change our societal behavior towards all non-human animals. Over the last couple of 100 years or so, there have been a number of progressive changes in human animal societies in terms of the values that we place on one another and the rights that we have given to one another after many millennia of the most extraordinary prejudice and violence against minorities and so on. And of course, as we know, all of that is imperfect. We haven't got to a place yet, even within our human animal society, where everybody genuinely has equity and everyone is given appropriate respect and opportunity to fulfill all of their potential, and is given an equal opportunity to live in safety and comfort and have all of their essential rights respected. We've still got a long way to go in that regard. But in terms of our response to the current situation that we face with things like climate catastrophe, I don't think climate emergency really tells the story anymore. We started off by calling it global warming, and then climate change, and then we go to climate emergency. I don't think that tells us anything like as how significant this issue is. It is genuinely existential for life on Earth. And the problem is caused by human animals, and those who are going to experience the worst effects of that almost inevitably are those persecuted and downtrodden minorities in human society, but also those many trillions of non-human animals who are not responsible for any of the threats that we currently face. And I think that we can only really respond effectively to that challenge and many of the challenges that we still face in human society if we change our attitude towards non-human animals. I believe that that's the bedrock of our ethical understanding of what it is to be a human animal amongst many other species, as well as our own. I think that should be the foundational ethic, is how do we regard those who are most at our mercy? How do we treat those who have the least amount of power? That is how you determine, I think, whether or not a community truly deserves the appellation civilized. We talk about human civilization over and over again. I don't actually think we've currently got any human society that truly merits the term civilized at the moment, whether that's still the exploitation of certain segments of the human community or its generalized attitude towards all non-human animals. And until we address that, we are not going to get, I do not think, into a place where everyone, irrespective of their species, is genuinely going to be safe on this planet. And yet the failure to focus on that primary issue is going to lead to the destruction of civilization as we know it, as it is so called, whether or not it deserves that or not, but we describe ourselves as a technological advanced civilization. Whether that survives or not is down to how we regard one another and all those others. and whether or not there is going to be a future for our species and all those multitudes of other species is down to how we now think about what I regard as the most fundamental issue we all face. And I think the bedrock of all of that, as I say, the foundation of how we begin to address something that is genuinely existential is how do we treat and regard the littlest amongst us, those who have the least power, those who are most at our mercy, those who are least responsible for the problem, but whose role in the whole fabric of life on Earth is so absolutely pivotal and crucial to our own survival as well as their own. And for me, the way that we address all of that is when we're all vegan. I mean, that's just like the basic ethical position that we have to adopt. If we are vegan, then that means what we have chosen to do is to think with consideration about the needs and the wants of everyone on Earth, irrespective of their species membership, irrespective of how many legs they may have, whether or not they have skin or fur or scales, whether they fly, whether they creep, whether they crawl, whether they run, whether they're on sea or land or in the rivers. It doesn't matter, because it ought not to matter. So the vegan philosophy, the foundation of that, is to say that everybody should have equal regard. And it has to be rights-based. It's not about a welfare position, about looking after some of the day-to-day activities that they may want or may not want and trying to match somebody else's needs versus our own needs. It is about respecting their fundamental rights, and that is the right to life, that is the right to safety, it's the right to freedom from persecution and exploitation. It is a right not to be at the end of any prejudice from anyone. And that's got to be the fundamental way that we look at not only one another as humans. And as I said at the beginning, we've made some strides towards that. Certainly, if we look at the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights that we put together nearly 80 years ago, that started the conversation about what rights are fundamental to everyone, irrespective of their faculties, irrespective of where they are in terms of the human community, in terms of their background, their gender, their race, whatever it may be, their sex. None of that should matter, because those rights should be fundamental and available to all. And for me, that's just got to be extended into a declaration of animal rights, that all animals on this planet are equally deserving of the rights that we have ascribed to ourselves. And we now need to extend that and give those same rights to everyone else. If we do that, if we make that change, then that fundamentally changes everything in terms of what we do with the planet, in terms of our use, quote marks, our use of what we call resources, you know, the forestry land that we have, the seas and those who live in those seas, in terms of our own exploitation, so-called, of various, you know, like I say, resources on the planet. It changes how we think about what we do with everything. And because we have to take regard for the impact of those things on others. And if we have to take regard of those who, for example, live in the rainforest, then you don't just destroy them. And if you have to have regard for those who live in the seas, you can't just exploit them. You can't just send your trawlers out and pull up trillions of sea lives every year and expect to be able to go back again and do the same thing next year without regard for what has happened to those trillions of lives once you drag them from their home. And if you have to have regard for those who live next door to your own home, you know, if there's some wooded area that you live next door to, you have to take regard for who lives there and the fact that it is a home to somebody else. And if you start to have to think fundamentally about what that means, then that changes how we do everything as a community and as a society. And I would suggest that that means that we end up with a much better society, because it's one that takes into account everybody's needs, and we start to begin for the first time, and probably for many, many thousands of years as a species, not to overexploit. It's always going to be the case that as human animals, we are going to have to, you know, we need to survive too. We want to live too. We want to eat. We want to drink. We want to have enough space to be able to live our own lives. So we're always going to have a footprint of some kind, but it is about only doing what we need to do, rather than the mass consumption and thus the mass destruction of what we weirdly call the natural environment, as though there's some other kind of environment as well. You know, we have to regard reasonably what we do and how far we go and what we really need just to be comfortable and happy and safe and secure. And we can learn an awful lot from our non-human animal friends when we do that, because if we see what they do and the fact that they live in balance with the world around them, then if we do the same thing and live alongside all those other species and allow them to have the space that they need along with the space that we need, there is enough for everyone, and none of it has to be devastated in a way that certainly since the Industrial Revolution, we've seen how that level of destruction and our violence against the quote marks natural world has accelerated and continues to accelerate, even though we are warned by virtually every scientist going on the planet, you know, about the significance and the seriousness of what we are doing and how it simply is not sustainable anymore. And they all do make particular reference to animal farming, including sea farming in that respect, and just how destructive and damaging that is. They do mention that. Whether our politicians actually pick up on it is a different matter entirely. But they do say this is simply not sustainable and we cannot do this anymore if we are going to have a future. Despite the violence and aggression of humanity, I think there are some good things about human animals. We can be kind and generous. We can be creative. We can share beautiful things. We can create music and poetry and joy, and we can do so many fabulous things if we put our minds to it. We just need to reorient our focus around the things that are positive and allow us to grow individually and as a community, but do not involve the exploitation and destruction of any others. And veganism is, for me, the foundation of all of that. It is, for me, the most complete philosophy the human animal has ever conjured from its imagination. And it is the most honest philosophy we have ever conjured. And it is the one that literally includes everyone. All other political philosophies and religious creeds and dogmas and so on, one way or another, they always seek to exclude some parts of the community. They always have someone that you belong to the right ones, but there's always therefore the wrong ones. Whereas the vegan philosophy just says, hey, it's everyone. You know, we are interdependent. It is a global community of lives on Earth, and we are absolutely reliant upon one another for our survival. And we need to give proper, reasonable respect to all who have life. And veganism just embraces every life on Earth and says, let's run with that. And if we were to do that, if we were to make that choice, my goodness, what a wonderful world we would have. Happy to have a conversation about that, if anyone has any thoughts around
that. I have a good question for you, Richard. So all this that you've said this evening, did you have all that developed when you went for election, entered politics, and why did you choose to go into politics as a way to try to achieve animal rights?
Yeah, I think I'd pretty much had all of that worked out. And a lot of that went into the manifesto that myself and my colleague Yasmine developed for the elections that we stood in. Where I probably would say what I would probably change now compared to this, to then, and it goes back to something I know Roger used to talk about some years ago, was about the idea of vegan being a scare word. It's strange how things have changed in recent years, But if you go back 10 or 15 years, then you didn't see the word vegan on adverts, television adverts and products, available in supermarkets and things. People didn't openly talk about it. You can hardly avoid the word now. You open up a newspaper or read it online and you see them articles about vegans and what vegans are up to, whether it's vegan athletes or products that vegans eat and foodstuffs and so on or whatever. And you see it a lot more than you did 10 or 15 years ago. So probably where we were probably a little bit cautious in our manifesto and in the conversations we had when we were standing for election was probably not using the word vegan as much as I would do now. And that's partly because of the lack of, it just wasn't used in the same kind of way then as we see, and we have seen, and certainly in the last 4 to 5 years, in the last 2 to 3 years, things have changed significantly. But pretty much we had it, but in terms of like the overall philosophy, the overall idea that what we needed to do politically and socially was radically alter the structure of our society and to ensure that we included necessarily the rights of non-humans as well as humans in society was all there in the manifesto. And part of the reason why Yasmin and I and others who were involved in the party that was called Animals Count then, in the UK it's now called the Animal Welfare Party. They changed the name after Yasmin and I left. So back then, the way that we would try to articulate that was by saying that with where politicians are at the moment simply isn't going far enough. They are not including the issues that are fundamental to how we improve society for everyone. And so we wanted to cajole and, if you like, goad the major political parties into taking some of those issues much more seriously than they were. They largely ignored anything to do with non-humans in terms of their rights or in terms of any need to even have a position on non-human animals or the environment or anything like that. Even back then, people were talking about climate change, of course, and using terms like the climate emergency. But you go back to 2008, 2009, 2010, when we were standing for election, none of the parties had a position on any of that stuff, really, at all. I went along to some hustings which were put together by various organizations to try and get those companies to talk about these kinds of things, and they really didn't have much to say at all. And to be honest, in the last 10 years, their position hasn't really changed. They may mention the word environment or climate change a lot more. They may claim that they put out papers and position statements on the whole thing. But essentially, as we've all probably noticed, their policies remain exactly the same. There is still going to be far more oil and gas exploration. They refuse to do anything at all about animal agriculture and its damaging environmental impacts. The UK government only last week released their so-called food strategy, and they deliberately avoided even mentioning animal agriculture, even though the advisors who put a report together for them said, you've got to talk about this stuff. They just ignored it anyway. So even though some politicians may talk about these things now, their position is exactly the same. Their focus is still in exactly the same place. They still are lobbied by, and indeed are in the pockets of, those global corporations who profit from fossil fuels and from animal agriculture and so on. And none of that has changed. So back then, though, 10 or so years ago, that is one of the things that we tried our best to influence those political parties on that. We wanted to get involved and have conversations with them. We knew that as a small, very small political party, we certainly in the United Kingdom, with its first past the post process elections and stuff, we really didn't stand a chance of actually being elected directly ourselves, even though some of our sister organizations, as they were called at the time, had some electoral success in other countries such as the Netherlands and Germany, because they have very different political electoral systems. In the UK particularly, we knew we just really didn't stand a chance of election, but it was about provoking the conversation. When I went along to a hustings and I talked about these issues, and I mentioned this stuff, well, the other candidates standing on the same platform, they had to say something about it. They didn't really say very much, but at least at the time, we felt at least we're making them talk about these kinds of things. And our hope at that time was that would be the beginning of a process to get those organizations, those other political parties, to talk about these things, to get the media to take these issues much more seriously, and to start to raise these kinds of questions with those candidates from the big political parties. I'm not convinced that we really made as much difference as we'd hoped to. And I think part of that was not because of our lack of effort. We really tried. You know, we traveled thousands of miles. We put leaflets in every door. We made the maximum benefit of the opportunities we had to participate in the media, whether that's television, national newspapers, local newspapers, and so on, going on social media at the time. We did all that we could, but it's not a surprise for me to tell anyone, you know, that certainly, well, not just even in the West, really, but in so many places on this planet, the political systems are so corrupted. They are so owned by those who already have power and wealth, that the only way that you seemingly are able to exert effective influence is to have somebody standing behind you who has vast amounts of wealth or power already. And if I could just, you know, reflect upon the UK at the same time, you know, what we had back then was a party called the United Kingdom Independence Party, UKIP, which at the time was, I don't know, the dictator of that was Nigel Farage, who still lingers on this planet and still irritates so many people with the things that he says. But he started off like having no influence and no pay. It was just like somebody babbling on the sideline. But what he got was somebody with tens of millions of pounds to bankroll a major campaign to push him and his ideas absolutely everywhere. And before you know it, he's been invited multiple times onto major current affairs programs like the UK's Question Time. He's being invited onto news programs to talk about what he wants to talk about, which at that time was like the UK getting out of the EU. And my word, how successful he ended up being with that one, purely because of the money that was there. You go back to the very beginning, he had nothing. I had nothing. He ended up with tens of millions of pounds being bankrolled by people who were happy to see him promote his ideas because they could see the benefit to them. And all of a sudden, he's everywhere. And he got to a point where he could influence the UK government and cause them to alter their position on things like the EU and holding referendums and so on. And look where the United Kingdom is now and all the things that have happened subsequently. But what we didn't have was that happy benefactor who also had 30 or 40 million pounds to spend on us to help us to get onto current affairs programs and invited onto the BBC News to talk about our ideas and things. Even though I would say things like the climate emergency, things like the environmental impact of animal agriculture, things like the rights of non-humans and how much we are damaging so many other lives and how significant that's ultimately going to be for us, let alone for them as well anyway. We have to always bear in mind their rights and the suffering that they undergo. Those issues are far, far more significant than whether or not the UK 7 or 8 years ago should have held a referendum on membership of the EU. That's trivial, obviously, compared to the climate catastrophe, compared to the catastrophic decline in insect numbers, the destruction of the rainforest, you know, the pollution of the rivers and the oceans, you know, the emptying of the oceans of all sea lives. All of those things are fundamental and existential for our society, as well as, of course, being the cause of so much individual suffering to so many trillions of other sentient lives. Those things mattered, but how could we, through that political process, really leverage as much as we wanted to? Ultimately, no. And that was one of the reasons I think both Yasmin and I stepped away after a few years of trying multiple elections. We felt there needed to be some other process that we could engage in, because that political system, particularly in the UK, but I think also in so many other places, is so damaged, so corrupted, that we really did not stand a chance of getting our voice heard in a way that was going to be genuinely effective.
Thank you. In the event of nobody else asking, where is Yasmin today, or what is she doing, please, Richard?
Yeah, Yasmin stepped away from the political sphere and has taken on a number of roles with various green organizations such as ProVeg and things like that. And she's currently the CEO of an organization that promotes green living and vegan living, and they use the vegan word an awful lot, and plant-based and things. So she's out there using a different process to try and leverage influence amongst the decision makers and, you know, the legislatures and stuff like that. So she's still trying, and I'm trying through my other processes as well. My thing is the spoken word, and I do as many talks as I can in schools and colleges, and taking part in festivals and events and things like that, and trying to reach out in particular. And what I've been doing for 50 years, what I was doing before the political thing had continued afterwards, is particularly trying to reach out to the younger generation, because my generation seriously screwed up. We had opportunities. We were told about these things. We knew these things 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 30 years ago, 40 years ago. It's over 60 years since Rachel Carson released The Silent Spring, talking about damage to the environment. It's now coming up for 50 years since Peter Singer released Animal Liberation. We've known about these things for so long, and yet my generation just didn't do what it needed to do. And so my hope is that those generations growing up now, faced with something that is getting much more urgent and much more serious, even when it was then, and my God, it was serious even in the 70s and 80s and 90s, let alone now. My hope is that they are going to be much more open and switched on to listening to new ideas, different ideas, and won't fall into the traps of just folding into old ways of doing things, or feeling like there is no alternative to the current system, as though there's no alternative to capitalism, as though there's no alternative to mass consumption, as though there's no alternative to the fact that humans regard themselves as being better than all non-humans, and that we can therefore do as we please with anyone, no matter what the suffering is caused to them, and no matter how trivial it may be what we want to take from them for our own benefit. And whenever I've given those talks, whenever I've shared a space with those younger generations, they are so open to those ideas in a way that my generation just never was, certainly not to the degree that it ought to have been. We had an opportunity, I think, to do so much more in the last 20 or 30 years. For whatever reason, we just didn't do it.
Can I ask you a question?
Yeah, sure, of course.
Okay, good. Now, what I was thinking of, one of the things I was thinking about with what you were talking about is the whole idea of profit motive. You mentioned that profit motive. I mean, the old human greed. And it's sort of a minor thing, but in another way, it's sort of a hopeful thing over here in the States, that oat milk has taken off like you wouldn't believe. And you know who's making oat milk? The same people who made dairy milk. But is that, at least they're not doing it with the cows now. I just think it's fascinating. It's like demand is answered by another product. So I mean, so at least there is a demand that's been built, that and many people are really people I never would have thought. When I go to the coffee shop, lots of people that I never would have thought ask for oat milk. And so I think that there's a definite edging. I heard someone say the other day that things are changing, and it's really slow, and it's nowhere near what it ought to be. But I just sort of take heart from little things like that people are actively seeking alternatives.
Yeah.
And it doesn't even taste bad. It tastes okay. It's okay. So that's good. But I mean, the other profit motive that I, certainly think an awful lot about, I haven't figured out, is the whole thing of the military industrial complex. I mean, all these people making nuclear weapons like Raytheon and all those people. I mean, all those people selling, as many armaments, as many versions of them as possible to whomever wants them, like the Saudis. The Saudis buy tons and tons. What to do? I mean, because it's like it would seem like if there was some way to add that to our list of what we want, that we want people not to make things that are going to destroy the earth. Well, I mean, why can't they make something else? I mean, why can't they make some other version like oat milk? Why can't they, just change things up? So I guess I'm just thinking that's another perspective that, and I was, like I said, I'm really surprised at how receptive and how aware people are that I never thought would be about this one little thing. But I say I'm trying to carry it over and think about how to implement things like that, or suggest things like other things to people, other ways, like Raytheon, like all those people who want to make something, have them make something else.
Yeah, it's a perfectly good point, and we have to take the positives wherever we can find them.
Yeah.
And you can largely rely on at least some capitalist companies for identifying a new market and seeing that they can leverage that for their own balance sheet, and they're increasing their own profits. And I think that is genuinely one of the reasons why we do see the word vegan a lot more than we did 5 years ago, 10 years ago. Because of those consumer products, and because they saw that they could make a bigger markup on those products. Right. But there was a captive market there. Yeah.
It lets the cows off the hook, or at least some of them. I mean, if we could just keep up that sort of effort, I think it would be fascinating. I mean, one thing we've done in the Boston area, we did lots and lots of protests against Raytheon. You know what they did? They moved to Washington, D.C. Yeah. We sort of got rid of them, but not as much as we wanted to. But anyway, yeah. Well, we'll see.
Indeed so, and it is about, it's about finding opportunity where you can. And we have to say, look, the capitalist system isn't going to go away tomorrow afternoon. No. It's kind of there at the moment. We want to speak to the younger generation. We do want to speak amongst ourselves and work out better, more effective ways of managing our society, perhaps not having such a centralized political and commercial systems that allow a small minority to dominate absolutely everything and to accrue enormous profit to themselves at the expense of other smaller companies and more localized governance and support and community. So we want to change things. But yes, absolutely, if we see that there are more products on the shelves and those products use the word vegan, and then people do see little featurettes on various programs on television talking about the benefits of plant milks and things like that, if they do that and they pick up on that, then that is an opportunity for us as vegans. And for me, vegans always means being an ethical human being who's focused on the ethics of that philosophy of life. That gives us an opportunity, a way in to talk to those people about those kinds of things. If they're already having plant milk, but not necessarily doing the rest of it, or haven't considered the ethics particularly, then the fact they're doing one thing and they see that word vegan, for me, hope that's a way in, to start having those conversations with people, getting them to take on board, what it really means, to be vegan. It's not about just having plant milks. It certainly isn't about just thinking about your own health benefits, although that's a nice byproduct of having a plant-based diet. That's fine. It's about thinking about what are the fundamentals of that philosophy, and the fundamentals of that philosophy are respecting the rights of everyone who has life. And when we do that, as I said, we can have a much nicer, much kinder, much more generous and compassionate, much more equitable society. Everyone gets what they need. Nobody has way more than they really do need. We don't need somebody like Elon Musk to have $180 billion as a private wealth. And Bezos does not need $160 billion as his private wealth. Whenever people raise those kinds of questions about billionaires in the UK, we're always told that you're against entrepreneurship and you're against innovation and all that nonsense. And I really do not believe that that is true at all. If you think, for example, it's slightly, tangential and things, but you think about the space race in the US in the 1950s and 60s and so on. Yes, there were various political things behind it in terms of the race with the USSR at the time and things, but there was so much creativity and innovation amongst hundreds of thousands of people working in various aspects of science to make a human endeavor possible, which was landing a human person on the moon, you know, and they achieved that. And there was extraordinary creativity involved in doing that. And if you think about, you know, some of those more cosmic things that we get involved in, like sending probes to the other planets, and you know, we've got spacecraft whizzing away from the solar system at 40,000 miles an hour that we sent into space 40 years ago. There's some seriously clever stuff behind all of that. You know, people are capable of the most brilliant creativity and ingenuity without there needing to be a massive profit motive behind it. You know, so you know, it doesn't. So it's absurd to suggest that just because it's an affront to anything that's decent and moral for a single individual such as Jeff Bezos to have $160 billion doesn't mean you're against people being innovative or creative or thinking about new ways of doing things, whether that's commerce or whatever it might be. We can do those creative things, but we surely, as a species, need to recognize that there's got to be limits, hasn't there? You know, on how much one person needs to accumulate personally just for themselves, particularly as you can be aware at exactly the same time of how little so many others have. And how you can sit there and be comfortable about having $160 billion when you know that people have literally less than $1 a day to survive on, and actually no food today to eat. How you can be comfortable, how any human could be comfortable with that, I have absolutely no idea. So I just think that we can be a creative, innovative, brilliantly collaborative species if we truly put our minds towards the good stuff and focus on the good stuff. You know, you're absolutely right to mention that military industrial complex and the sheer amount of effort that goes into creating newer, more intricate ways of destroying one another. When you think we could use that ability, that scientific knowledge, that capacity, that intellectual curiosity and capacity to think, well, how can we solve like the water problems that we've got, you know, in terms of like water shortage for people in various parts of the earth? How can we solve the issue of like, you know, the fact that we've got so much carbon already in the atmosphere? How do we turn things around quickly so that we stop that accelerating at the rate that it has been doing over recent years? We could use all of that knowledge and we could do it in such a brilliantly positive, affirmative way. We just have to change what we're focused on. And rather than being focused on division and seeing borders between like land masses that randomly at some point, accidentally in history, somebody decided that that's where Germany ends or that's where the Ukraine begins. You know, it's just an absolute nonsense. As Carl Sagan so often said, you know, you go out into space, you look down, you can't see any borders. They're not there. And, you know, the planetary system, you know, our weather systems, our climate does not recognize any borders. You know, it's just not there. You know, the clouds are going to go where the clouds are going to go. The carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is going to go where it's going to go. The pollution in the seas and rivers is going to go where it's going to go. It doesn't stop at any border. It just flows. And so, you know, if we can turn our mind away from division and seeing instead the things that we have in common, then surely we can start to see how we can use our creativity, our intelligence and our ingenuity in a really positive way. And when I'm talking about commonalities and things that we share, of course, that's not only things that we share as human animals, it's all of those things that we share with non-humans as well. You know, there is so much that is so similar amongst all of us, you know, whether we're talking about the whales in the oceans, whether we're talking about woodlice crawling along, you know, outside by your shed, whoever these people may be, whether it's pigs and chickens and cow people, whoever they are, there is so much that we share, including this just one planet that we have and its one single planetary atmosphere. There's not a lot of it. You know, there's been some brilliant pictures taken by NASA over the years that show, you know, the Earth kind of like almost like edge on, and you see the landmass, and then you see the atmosphere, and then you see the blackness of the cosmos outside, and that atmosphere is incredibly thin. The amount of, I mean, it looks big from down here, particularly to me, it's not quite little, so it looks like there's a lot of it out there. But if you look at it edge on, you know, from outside, The planetary atmosphere we have is such an incredibly thin thing. It is so fragile. And other planets, you know, we try to learn from what we can understand about the rest of the cosmos. Other planets in our own solar system, such as Venus and Mars, tells you about what can happen when things go wrong, if things change. You know, Venus tells us what happens if you have runaway greenhouse effects. You know, it wasn't always the way that it is today. Billions of years ago, it was much warmer and wetter as well. But, much cooler and wetter than it is today. But now the average temperature on the surface is something like 300 or 400 degrees Celsius, you know, and the atmosphere is absolutely toxic, would be to all life on Earth. And if you look at Mars, you know, Mars used to be wet, and who knows whether there was life forms there 2 or 3 billion years ago. But when climates can change, when atmospheres can get blown off into outer space, when you can lose things, then you see how quickly things can change on the cosmic scale. And it's just absolutely I've got a wind now. So we've got, you know, an opportunity here to recognize that, you know, even just by looking in our own local solar neighborhood, we can see what the dangers are. And we can look at our own planet. We can look at the graphs that those thousands of scientists producing year on year. And now they're starting to use some seriously scary language when they say, just look at this, look at the direction these things are going. We need to change, and we need to change, and we need to do it now. And for me, the only realistic opportunity that we have to do that is if we fundamentally rethink who we are as a species on Earth, and we fundamentally rethink our relationship with all those other species on Earth, because we absolutely need each other. Well, I say we need other species a hell of a lot more than any non-human species needs humanity. They were doing fine for hundreds of millions of years, really. It was okay. And then we come along. But we are absolutely dependent.
Doing fine without us, Richard. Could
Absolutely.
I ask you a question?
Sure, go for it.
Yeah, well, first of all, thanks for the talk. In fact, with a bit more practice, Richard, I reckon you'd be quite good at this. So, so keep going. No, we're actually blessed to have somebody so geographically close to us who is so, you know, great articulate voice for other animals. I want to ask about something, your expertise really, about what you know, Sentient Rights Ireland could do in terms of how they proceed from here. I was interested in your talk. You talked about respecting rights, which implies moral rights, but you also talked about giving rights, which implies legal rights. Do you think the best process from now would be to concentrate on cultural issues and talk about moral rights and trying to get the respect for other animals as rights bearers? Or do you think it's time to go to the legal system and talk about, you know, giving other animals rights? You know, do you think there's a conflict there, or do you think one will flow from the other, or what?
It's a good question. I think they're complementary, and I think you could, and I think I probably used to look at it in the legalistic side first, followed by, you know, and hoping that legal change, getting the legislature, getting an executive in power to implement laws that respected those rights, and then obviously trying to then enforce changed behavior amongst the members of that society. I think now I look at it in a different way. And I think I kind of take a view of how things have changed in the human community over time, is that it, for me, and correct me if anybody's got any more detailed knowledge than I do on these issues, but it seems like legal change kind of came after the fact that there was pressure from society generally anyway, that things needed to change. I think that's been exclusively the case, but I think there's always been some pressure from society that says, look, this is like, you know, these persecutions take place, or this exploitation is taking place, or there are these inequalities in society, and you've got to do something about it. You know, whether it's the issue of slavery a couple hundred years ago, or voting rights to members of, back in the day, the working class community, or those who didn't have, you know, land rights and things already, and then extending that further to females in the human population, and then again looking at the rights of children, looking at sexual and gender rights and things like that. I think societal pressure has ultimately been the first thing that then causes legislative change. So I think the best thing we can focus on is talking about the ethics, is talking about the moral issues. And we can use the fundamentals of science and what we know, you know, to talk about, you know, the clearly obvious sentient awareness of all non-human animals that, you know, we know so much now. And it's obvious anyway, if you just spend any time in the company of a pig person or a cow person or a chicken person, whoever they might be, you know that there is someone, you know, and you know that they have an individual personality, and you know that they have an experience of the world that is uniquely and personally theirs, just as our experience is uniquely and personally ours. And I think if we talk about those kinds of things and we use that evidence, the evidence that's right before our eyes, along with the scientific knowledge that we have about the complexity of their minds and their bodies and how they experience the world, I think what we need to do is to really push that and have people understand that those things therefore matter. And if they, you know, all of those non-humans as the people that they so clearly are, well, surely we can't treat them in the ways that we currently are, just as back in the day, we said that you can't any longer treat these people who are currently slaves, because we now recognize that they're essentially the same as us. And you cannot avoid giving the right to female members of the population, because obviously they've got exactly the same faculties and abilities as anybody else has in society. So how can we claim that only one group can have these rights and not another group? And similarly with children, you know, how can we send them up chimneys and down coal mines and things when they're barely growing, and, you know, we're causing them intense stress and suffering, when we think, no, the things that we know about their lives, things we know about their experience of the world around them, that we have to change. I do think, Roger, that the morals is the way to go, and focusing on the ethics and ensuring, of course, that veganism is understood as an ethical philosophy, as something that is fundamentally about rights. And we don't lose sight of that just because there are now thousands of plant-based products that happen to use the word vegan. You know, I do want us to make sure that we keep the focus on those who are experiencing the worst of what humanity can do, which are all around non-human animal frenzy.
I'd agree with all that, Richard, and thank you for the answer. And you know, I think that the trend tends to be that moral rights become codified into law and therefore transferred into legal rights. And so I think you're right about that. But does that kind of imply that the first job for Sentient Rights Islands is to kind of act as a social movement organization rather than a political party? Because we need to shift the culture. And the irony here is that there's going to be pushback whichever way you go, because Sentient Rights Island is going to be operating within an animal welfare movement. Whereas if you then go to the politics, everything slides into welfare, because that's the only thing that politics understand. They can't get their head around rights, because it's obviously totally abolitionist. It just means, right, don't do that, end that, stop that, right? Which is not what they would tolerate.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it is that focus on the social and cultural aspects of what we are doing and the consequences of our current relationship with all of those non-humans. And that's the first thing that needs to be addressed. Like I say, I think if that's the foundation, if that's the bedrock of our thinking, then once that begins to shift, then so many things shift as well. It starts to alter the whole edifice. Everything starts to change, but that has to be the starting point, is our current relationship with non-humans and what that means for them in terms of their life experience, which, as we know, is inevitably brutalized and traumatized almost from beginning to end, but also the consequences from us. And we have to respect, of course, and understand that human animals are quite selfish, you know, and we do think about what things are like for us and what's in it for me kind of thing. Well, there are so many positives in it for us as humans if we change our relationship towards non-humans as well. I think so much flows from that becomes so positive and affirmative people might be surprised at just how much better it can get. But I do absolutely think that that's the way we have to go. We've got to create those social and cultural pressures and cause that to be the start of change.
I agree. Thanks for that, Richard. Cheers.
I can see a question. Sorry, I wasn't looking at the chat earlier. I do apologize. But I can see there's a question in there. Is vegan or vegetarianism mentioned in the Bible or any other holy book? It's a good question. And in terms of what we call the Bible, that is the foundational text for the Christian faith, it's not really, no. It doesn't really mention it. One of the things I talk about at the beginning of my book, The Meat Delusion, is that if you do look at the beginning chapters of Genesis, before humanity falls apart and becomes this horrible sin-ridden species that it's been ever since, but if you go back to before then, when everything was wonderful and fabulous in the Garden of Eden, that essentially is a vegan paradise, you know, and it does talk about the fact, you know, that the God creates like all the fruits of the earth, you know, for Adam and Eve to eat. And it talks about, you know, life and abundance for everyone else. There is no killing and there is no meat eating, as it's called meat eating, in the Garden of Eden. And it's only after the fall that the God then says that people should go around consuming animals and having meaty things to eat and things like that. It's almost like the God himself is saying that doing those things is fit only for a fallen species. When things were perfect, it was essentially like a vegan paradise in the Garden of Eden. But the Bible generally does not explicitly talk about veganism. Well, it certainly doesn't talk about veganism. It doesn't really talk about vegetarianism, although it may mention a few things that if you look at the passages from a certain light, you could say maybe are talking about respecting and caring about non-human animals. Although at the same time in the New Testament, Jesus is apparently happy to send devils into things like people like pig people and send them running off the end of a cliff. You know, he's quite happy to have thousands and thousands of fish people dragged up out of the Sea of Galilee and fed to people. It doesn't really appear to be a text that promotes certainly I wouldn't say it promotes a vegan philosophy at all. For me, what I would say in terms of that particular text itself is that hopefully there would always be an opportunity for re-examination of things. I mean, I'm always somebody who says like tradition is the worst possible reason for thinking or doing anything at all. Just because things were a certain way at a certain time, it doesn't have to always be that way. So those texts may say things in a certain way. It doesn't mean we have to take all of that absolutely as, to use a phrase, gospel, and therefore stick absolutely and rigidly to that. Just because it doesn't mention veganism doesn't mean to say that a Christian person of faith can't be a vegan. Of course they can. And you look at the positive things that you can take from, you know, those texts and use all of that in a really affirmative way, and try not to worry too much about, you know, what Jesus may have got up to back then. It's thousands of years ago. Let's not worry about it too much. In terms of other holy texts, some of the Hindu texts and the Jainist texts do come across pretty much as not only vegetarian, but they're well on the way to being basically as vegan as you can get. You know, if you look at the teachings of the Bhagavad Gita, for example, and the thoughts of Krishna, all of that is about the spark of life being in every life on earth and respecting them and caring for them. And it takes a much more holistic view of life on earth than some of those Abrahamic texts that are used by the faiths of Christians and Islam and Judaism. As I said, because they have their foundation in the Old Testament and the New Testament, however they might be described by those faiths, they don't quite have the focus on the spark of life being available and an intrinsic part of all lives on earth as what some of those Hindu texts do. And so you can certainly see that there's a lot of that there, definitely. Just have a look, see if there's any other questions that I may have missed.
I think I think that's about it, Richard. And
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
yeah, you've given us a lot of food for thought, and not least the bit that Roger introduced about how we might proceed in the future. I take this opportunity to thank everybody who turned up here tonight. That's great. Where we find the webinars are scoring is on our YouTube channel, where people come and view them at their leisure later on. And the last time I checked, which was over a week ago, we're up over 200 hits across all the webinars we've done since February. So that's really encouraging from our point of view. That's 200 people that hadn't checked it before, and we're delighted to be able to reach out to everybody and have the diverse messages that each speaker is able to give that is there on record for them. So Richard, on behalf of Sentient Rights Ireland and all the animals everywhere, I want to give you a really big thanks, and I hope to meet you in the future. All the best.
Absolutely. All right. Thanks so much. Have a good evening, everyone. Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Okay.
Thanks, Richard.
You're giving it a wrap there, Carol.